Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Tonight at Shevchenko Society we will have presentation book of Olya Samilenko. First of all, I would like to invite Dr. Alexander Motel, who will introduce our guest.
Thank you very much. I will literally speak for 30 seconds, maybe a little more, не довше 30-40 секунд, щоб не заважати нашому доповідачу. Хотів би коротко сказати. So, Dr. Samilenko was born in New York City, has lived a significant part of her time in Pennsylvania. She completed her doctorate from the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor in Slavic languages and literatures, and has been teaching at Goucher College in Baltimore in the Russian Studies program since roughly, I believe, the early 1990s, thereabouts. She took part and was a translator for the Commission on the Ukraine famine in the 1980s. So she was involved in a lot of that work, and as you'll see from today's presentation, and as you should see if and when you procure the book, that the famine features a significant part, plays a significant part in this particular novel. She's also a director of Russian and Slavic studies at Johns Hopkins University and has been active in the field of Slavic, Russian, and Ukrainian literature for the last 20, 30 or so years. And as I mentioned, has translated a lot. I had the distinct pleasure and honor of being involved in a very insignificant fashion with an earlier draft of this novel, and was impressed and certainly encouraged Dr. Samilenko to do what she decided to do anyway. She certainly did need my encouragement, and that is to say, to seek publication. Я вам більше не буду розповідати про сам роман. Вона, звичайно, пані доктор розповість. Хотів би просто додати, що якраз і такі романи надзвичайно важливі. Бо це не тільки роман, але він, звичайно, побудований теж на різних біографічних, автобіографічних деталях, так що тут є до певної міри правдива історія і, звичайно, роман, література. Мені здається, що якраз англомовна така література надзвичайно потрібна. Української мови є досить багато такого, хоча теж не дуже багато, але англійської дуже мало. In any case, thank you very much for your attention, Dr. Olya Samilenko.
Can everybody hear me as I speak now? Yeah? Because I'm a teacher, and I tend to walk around, and it's very artificial for me to stand behind a mic. So I'm going to gesticulate and, be myself a little bit, all right? So when Snow Goose came out about a year ago, and as I was waiting for Oprah's people to call me, I started doing book signings in the Washington and Baltimore area. And to my great shock, I realized that most Americans had forgotten what communism was all about. My students knew a lot about microaggression, but when it came to the big deeds of macroaggression, Stalin's elimination of 60 million of his own people, they were clueless. So I created a little PowerPoint, which I'd like to show you today. And the purpose of this is not so much to preach to the choir as to show you some documents which went into the creation of the historical novel. And I'm going to then read to you three excerpts based on these documents so that you can see how fiction was created out of reality. So without further ado, we can move on. So the novel takes place in 1929, but my story takes place in 1949, which is the year when the SS Ernie Pyle, named after the World War II journalist, docked in Boston Harbor, and on it were my two families, the MARCHENKO and the Samilenko. And both families came from Ukraine, the breadbasket of Europe. There you have Karelia, my father's town. My mother lived in a much smaller town called Mykhnovtsi. And at the time, Ukraine, of course, was under the heel, or more appropriately, the hammer and sickle of the Soviet Union. My family was considered persona non grata. They were, in fact, enemies of the people, and they took advantage of the winds of war to be blown into Germany. And they spent, this is Regensburg, Germany, a DP camp, where they spent 4 years, maybe familiar to you. This was the largest DP camp in occupied Germany, run by the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration. It came in sectors, and in the Ukrainian sector was a universe unto itself. There was a hospital, a printing press, even a fledgling university. And my dad, my father, Vasily Samilenko, took advantage of the entrepreneurial freedom that he had to start making pots and pans, which he ended up doing a brisk business, and he saved enough money to propose to this young lady, Vera Marchenko, in 1947. Unfortunately, on their wedding day, the German mark fell, and the couple was left completely penniless. But my father pulled himself up by his bootstraps, and there he is, 6 years later, standing on the embankment of the Statue of Liberty, looking at the Empire State Building, where on the 60th floor were the offices of Loewy's engineering firm, where my father worked as a draftsman. So we lived in a tenement just like this in the Lower East Side, a stone's throw away from here. And in my memory, the place caught fire at least 3 times, and I was spirited down those stairs to safety. Exercise was obtained by walks along the East River, and there I am with my mother and my maternal grandparents. You could say I had a very warm childhood, both figuratively and metaphorically. My parents loved me. I became a kind of a mascot for the people who came over on the SS Ernie Pyle. I was the first American child to be born in the new land. And so they would have these birthday parties for me every year. This is year 1. I look a little bit bewildered, but by year 4 I got into the swing of things, and there I am toasting myself, as you can see, with milk. The gifts that I would get at these events were extraordinarily inappropriate. My uncle gave me a mink muff and a mink hat for some reason on my 5th birthday, and that I would much have preferred a doll. Nevertheless, some of the gifts, there was one gift that exceeded all my expectations, and this was the story surrounding this woman, my paternal grandmother, Olya Samilenko. And when all the wine was drunk and all the food was eaten, my father would start reminiscing about the time when his mother smuggled out 4 boys from the Solovetsky Monastery, where she had been taken. She had been arrested in 1929. And he would cry terribly, and I knew nothing of the history, but it moved me deeply to see my father cry like that. And his story was pretty horrible because he talked about being hidden in a potato sack, being smuggled on the train in the potato sack, and also hiding out in a coffin on top of corpses. Well, this was as I said, really a very, very not the typical fairy tale that a child hears, but I forgot about it, and I went on until about 20 years later, I began working on the Famine Commission. And during that time, I learned that my family's woes were the cause of this benign-looking gentleman with a pipe who's seen here drafting a piece of legislation, and I'm going to say that that is his first 5-year plan. So what he did was created this plan, with four-pronged plan for the rapid industrialization of the Soviet Union, expansion of heavy industry by 330%, and that involved the liquidation of private farms and collective farms, the creation of collective farms. Well, there were problems with this, and more problems than we could probably say in this short time, but one problem was that, of course, the Soviet Union was an agricultural country. Number two, the private farmers, like my family, didn't really want to go into collective farms. But nevertheless, Stalin made quite a program of finding a scapegoat for what he planned to do. And he came up with this term, the kulak. Kulak in Russian means fist. So the idea was that the private farmers who were not wealthy by any means, but they just made a living and they were prosperous, they could feed themselves and their families, but they kept money and they kept their wealth, and they were saboteurs. They were sabotaging the progress that Stalin was trying to make. And so you have here in a cartoon where you see something very interesting. It's called defisting the kulaks. But if you look at that gentleman, he doesn't really look too Ukrainian, does he? He looks very much like Tevye, the dairyman in Fiddler on the Roof. So anti-Semitism became a handmaiden to his kind of this whole plan of defisting the kulaks. Here's another one that we have. This is eliminating kulaks. It's a class, уничтожим кулака как класс, and starting in 1928, if you take any periodical in Moscow, you will see cartoons like this. And recently, in preparing for this talk, I thought of myself, wow, 200 years before, isn't this what Peter the Great did in St. Petersburg, in building St. Petersburg, on the bones of Ukrainians, no less? So here we have the cyclicity of history. All right. So, crisis of Kulak included points that I could check off, all of them, because they all happened to my family. It involved confiscation of property and deportation to special labor camps, law of spikelets, in Ukrainian it's called Zakon Koloska, and that has to do with if you pick up a chaff of wheat in the fields, you are arrested, you're slammed with a 10-year sentence, and it happened to my maternal grandmother. And then, of course, you have the man-made famine. Well, the consequences were dire, right? Traditional villages and values were destroyed, churches were closed, icons burned, priests arrested, 24 million disappeared from rural areas, total decimation of Ukrainian intellectuals, and of course, all topped off by the creation of the Holodomor. Well, guess what? Collectivization was a resounding success. If you look at the number of collective farms in 1929, you have 57,000. By 1933, you have 2,204. Over 2,204, 16% increase. So yes, it was at a great price, but it was a success. And it was such a dizzying success that Stalin even wrote a speech in 1930 called Dizzy with Success. And he started opening up the doors of the Soviet Union to show the great progress that collectivization was making, and he invited this gentleman right here, Walter Duranty, to come. He's a New York Times journalist, to come and write to view the collective farms and to talk about them, talk about the progress that was made to the West. Well, there's a reason why I created a yellow background for him, because what he engaged in was yellow journalism. He absolutely hid the truth from the West and undeservedly won a Pulitzer in 1932. And so as far as posterity was concerned, his reporting fell flat, and the man who's responsible for publicizing the truth was Mr. Gareth Jones from the Manchester Times. And were it not for him, the world would not know about the famine. So I learned a lot about history while I worked for the Famine Commission, but I also translated and interpreted at hearings. And I had the tremendous good fortune of taking the testimony, interpreting and then translating my own father's story, which I had heard as a little girl. And that happened on October 26, 1986. And his testimony and the other testimonies we had at the hearing went into the report to Congress of the Commission on the Ukraine famine. And I left before the second volume was out. So I went on to have my own life. I began teaching in Baltimore. Then the family legend resurfaced yet again, this time more strongly. In 2005, my father died, and within 5 months of him, my uncle died as well. And I discovered in their effects, I discovered 2 manuscripts. And there are the 2 of them who were, despite being so different, they were like peas in the pod. So many of you may know, my father was a very modest man. He wasn't prone to public appearances, but maybe you do know my uncle, Olya Samilenko. In any case, their manuscripts were as different as they were. So my father was a thin man, and he wrote a partial history of my family and myself. And частина історії моєї родини і мене. And then my uncle, who was a little bit more expansive, wanted to speak for all Ukrainians, and he wrote about those who are silent forever. His was also longer. My father's was only 7 pages, and his was 14 pages. Well, I was astounded that my father, being such a quiet man, could actually give everything there was to know about his childhood in 7 pages, and including, this is my sketch, of the houses that were on the property. As I read, I started to sketch out the buildings, where everything was. Of course, I'm a dreadful artist, so I got a friend of mine who is in this audience to create a kind of a primitive rendering, which I like very much because it emphasizes the cleanness of the property. The 15 hectares that they were privileged to have, were populated by 20 oaks, 9 buildings, a building with a tin roof, which was the sign of an affluent peasant. And if you see here a maesternיה, which my grandfather filled with equipment that he imported from Germany, and their beloved mlyn, where he ground the wheat for neighboring peasants. And of course, this river is called the Udai, and there's the Levada. All right, and here's another one done by a student of mine that shows the oak tree that dominated the horseshoe courtyard. In 1997, my father and my uncle went back to see Volga, and this is what they found. So in 1929, the communists tore down the property, and they didn't build anything. What they did was crumble lives. My uncle, who was 5 years older than my father, was able to relate things that my father as a child could not. And one of the things he noticed was the fact that my grandfather had golden hands, that he was able to fix things, and he farmed, he fixed things, he read, so he wasn't just a farmer. One day he came from his teaching college to note that there was a turtle that was placed in the front yard. And he was amazed because he says here in 1927 my father was continuously rewarded by government as the best model farmer for Poltava region, and all this turtle meant that he was slow in in giving the grain to the government. And now it was shamed to the kulak saboteur, so he had changed overnight. The second time that my uncle came back for a visit around Christmas time, the family was gone. They had been taken. And Frida Semenyevna, who was the matriarch of a Jewish family who was friends with my father's family, told them where they were taken, and she also volunteered to go to Moscow to try to help get my grandfather out. She was an old SR who lived in New York for a while, and she went. She never came back. When she never came back, my uncle decided to find his family himself. So he went north. He came upon a railroad station of Lipsha in the north, and he was amazed because there were no people. There were tables covered with white tablecloths. There was food and wine, and indeed it was a Potemkin village, a railroad that was converted into a Potemkin village in anticipation of a visit of a Turkish dignitary. So he kept going, and he began to see things. He began to see abbreviations, a mess of abbreviations. He saw Kotlag, Svirlag, Belbadlag, Serendvinlag, and others, and that stands for labor, for working camp, or lager, right? And so eventually he found my grandfather, but he found him on his last legs. He found him in a cabin designated for goners. And in Ukrainian, goner is dohodящий. So there he was on his last legs. And at the time, my uncle had read in a paper that you could offer bail for relatives who couldn't work. So he had money with him. He was going to offer bail. He went to the commandant of this camp, and this man, Kuzmin, was sitting in a large, luxurious cabinet covered with a Persian rug. He had a big, huge desk with a green top. He had a pince-nez, he had reddish, violent hair and a mustache well groomed, and a uniform, a Gestapo uniform with a 3-rang rank of distinction. And this will come up later. I'm reading it to you now. So he brought the subject up of his grandfather, and he didn't take that well. And he turned to him, his eyes were bloodshot, and he said, "But he still has a tooth, does he not? We'll force him to work by his teeth, but his bones, remember his bones, will remain here forever." Well, for this act of insubordination, my uncle spent a few years in camp, and then was released in time to encounter the Holodomor in Alexandria, Ukraine. So when he came, he became a teacher. He realized that there were no students there. He had no pupils. He went knocking on doors. He opened the doors, and there were his students in jars, victims of cannibalism. So this was a very sad thing. But to me, even sadder was this list. Okay, so between 1929 and 1933, 13 family deaths of my family from unnatural causes. And there aren't that many Samilenko around anyway, and just think these people could have influenced me. I could have learned from them, and their lives were shattered. So I spent the years 2005 and 2013 teaching and thinking. And I taught literature, 20th century literature, in the target language, and there were lots of literature was written about the Gulag experience, and it fell into two camps. There was some very, very realistic depiction by Solzhenitsyn, and there was also the purges depicted as satire by writers like Bulgakov. And I noticed, and I experimented on my students, and I realized that reality is best served in a sugar-coated way. And I realized that my students learned better if they had humor, with the story. So in 2013, I continued to teach, but I stopped thinking, and I wrote the Snow Goose Chronicles. I called it that because of this picture, because of the great love my father and I had for birds, and also because by that time there weren't that many witnesses. They had all died, and it was only the birds that flew overhead that actually saw the truth. My novel had 56 characters. The ones in blue are my family members. First and foremost was my uncle Matthew in the book. There you see him. Hrisha Gregory was the eldest son. Vasily, my dad, my father, my tato. And Alexander, Sasha. Of course, there we have a picture of Vanya. And Stepan is their uncle who was with UPA, and he ended up in Poland. There's my uncle's wife, Dina, ended up as being a model for Frida Semenievna. Volodya is Oleg, my cousin Olya Samilenko, and that's my mom, and she too made it into the story. But she made it into the children's colony at Solovki. And this is her and her sister in a children's home in an orphanage in Rostov-na-Donu, where she spent some years, about 10 years. Okay, Stalin made it into the novel, as did KLIM VOROSHILOV, another historical character. Gareth Jones became Osmond DROOD, the good journalist who helps Oksana escape with her children. And then, of course, there was Oksana. So by now, I realized that I couldn't really rely on any written accounts. There were none. She was a very quiet person. And the pictures that I remember in childhood, I could never find. And so I had to create a conflation between what I knew about Oksana and what I knew about Anna Marchenko, my maternal grandmother, who, as luck would have it, herself did time on the Moscow-VOLGA Canal from 1934 to 1939. And her story has to do with the chaff of wheat. So Kolaska, she was going home, she picked up some wheat, and she said goodbye to her family for 10 years. And this is an amazing photograph, because if you look at that, you could probably never guess that this was a labor camp. It looks like an outing, a Sierra Club or a women's club. You know, it's so the look on those faces is so is one of resignation and calm, I think. So the hero of the story, Vakula Tumbleweed, has no human model, and if you read the novel, you'll know why he has no human model. He's not quite human. But he does have the romance between Oksana and Vakula, Perikote Pole, was inspired by two eponymous characters in Hoho's story, Christmas Eve, and that's in the second volume, Вечера на хуторе близ Диканьки, and there, Vakula, my Vakula is very different from the good Vakula in Goy. Mine is actually the devil next door. From the moment he appears, he brings discord into Valky. So if you think of Valky as the latter-day reincarnation of Dikanka, of Voda's Dikanka, then Vakula's presence erodes that. And he continues to do his job in undermining Oksana's confidence in herself throughout the novel. So the novel had many themes, and two themes in particular was to entertain and enlighten. And I wanted light to come out of the darkness, and I wanted people who knew nothing about Ukrainian history to really understand what went on, and to, in this way, to kind of pay homage to my family. So I knew that Americans wouldn't know the history, and I commissioned a Cleveland artist, Arabella Proffer, to create little oil paintings for each chapter, and there were 9 chapters, and she did it for 8. These never made it into the book. I have even better ones in the book, but these do illustrate kind of what happened. So in the first chapter, the journey to Solovki takes place. The second chapter, we have the actual monastery, which was built in the 16th century. And if you look at it from a bird's eye view, it looks very much like a ship. After Oksana and her children escape, they need identity. They need a passport, and this is the chapter where they get their new identity. Then they catch the Red Star Express to the Soviet nowhere. Okay, and while famine is raging, Oksana experiences plenty of food on this luxury train. This train ends in Kiev at the Mariinsky Palace, which is overgrown in weeds, and the weeds look very sinister for a very good reason, because famine is raging in Kiev, and on the first floor of this venerable Catherine the Great, Catherine the First Palace, is an agricultural school where students study nematodes. And so, in a little bit of irony, the biggest nematode of all is Stalin, who also ends up in this building and meets some of the characters. Oksana in the novel is the daughter of a priest, and of course she visits the Pechevska Lavra and encounters a massacre of some of the monks, and that is depicted by the red blood rising from the floor into the sky. And in one of the last chapters, chapter 8, we have the Passage Hotel. Many of you may have visited it in Odessa, which has the goddess Fortuna on the top, and that's very fitting because the fate of the characters is decided in this chapter. There's another chapter as well. Many themes. First and foremost, social engineering and income redistribution does not work. The theme of internal exile, national identity. Who is Ukrainian? Both Oksana and Vakula Perikotepula are from the same village, yet one is the Ukrainian patriot and the other one is a Bolshevik. Gentile-Jewish relations, well, Frida Semenovna was, and her family were very close, and in the novel there's another narrative line describing what happens to her and her son. Love versus duty, feast versus famine, town versus country, east versus west, another theme, divine retribution, and my personal favorite, satire. And in the novel there are many scenes which would, for example, in other Gulag literature, or literature that is truly Gulag literature, would have been rendered in an extremely realistic and a very serious way. And in the way that I treat it, they aren't. So this is the end of the first part of my presentation. And now I'm going to move on to the second part of my presentation. I'm going to read you 3 excerpts. The first one will be the first meeting between Vakula and Oksana. The second one will be, and the selections were a little bit of international. So the first one, 2 Ukrainians. The second one, we have the storyline of Frida Goldman, who's patterned on Frida Semenovna, going north, like my uncle did, to find her son. And she speaks to a commandant, and the language that you see in that document will be familiar to you. And the third one, yet another international touch, we have Karim Hassan, who is the Turkish ambassador, who was actually supposed to visit Yepsha at the time of my uncle's visit, is here in a 3-way kind of satirical dialogue where he tries to woo Oksana. So let me read you the chapters, and I'm going to speak in funny voices. I hope you don't mind, and I hope you won't be bored. So the first tak, okay, чуйте. So the scene is Oksana, who is the miller's daughter, comes from out of a morning's feeding of pigs and encounters this stranger in front of her house trying to steal her son's pet goose. And it turns out that this is a cousin of her husband's who's been away for about a decade, and he's wearing an Austrian greatcoat. Vakula rolled a cigarette, removed a cigarette and match from the pocket of his voluminous overcoat and leaned back against the oak. His steel-gray eyes surveyed the horseshoe curve of the courtyard. Say what you will, but we Kozaki are hard to kill, Vakula exclaimed, taking a puff. I was wounded, survived, got demobilized in Warsaw, stayed there a few years, and then traveled around a little bit in Europe. Now I'm back for an extended visit, possibly forever. It all depends. Well, never mind. We'll have plenty of time to discuss my plans, he said, breaking off. Tumbleweed's eyes grew moist. But enough of me, said Vakula suddenly. Let me look at you, Oksanochka. You've become so terribly efficient. You and that husband of yours have turned this wild wolf's den into a veritable Tsar's palace. Well, I wouldn't go as far as to say we live in a palace, said Oksana hurriedly. But yes, we are comfortably well off, thanks to Matvi's golden hands. He built everything himself, from scratch, log by log. Perhaps you'd like a tour, she added quite unexpectedly. Why, I thought you'd never ask, cried Vakula. Following Oksana, Tumbleweed swaggered into Volky as if he owned the place. Oksana, meanwhile, tried her best to keep at least a meter between herself and her distant past, a past that had suddenly resurfaced like the seasonal pox. This is the barn. We have 4 cows, 2 calves, and over there at the far end are my sheep. There used to be 10, but we lost one last night, said Oksana sadly. She started to name the sheep individually, but seeing the bored look on Vakula's face, quickly moved on to the stable, which contained 5 horses. Next, she showed him the chicken coop with its 100 chickens, and of course, Oksana's least favorite place, the pig enclosure. As they walked past the snorting pigs, Vakula's hands groped Oksana. She quickly pushed it away. For one brief second, Oksana struggled with the idea of pushing Vakula into the pig pen and shutting the gate. But she quickly suppressed this thought, which would have been beneath a grown woman of 35, not to mention a respectable wife and mother. She showed him the orchard, which contained apple and pear trees, now quite bare and forlorn-looking. On the fringes, more buildings could be seen that were intended for storage. The biggest structure was almost as big as the main house. It contained farming equipment, including the prized oil press Oksana's husband had imported from Germany. When the technician from Germany never came, Matthew took the press apart and figured out how to operate the machine himself, Oksana explained proudly. And over there, on the very edge of the Udai, is our pride and joy, the grist mill. Matthew also imported the parts from Germany. He's at the mill right now. If you like, I'll send one of the boys to fetch him. He'll be thrilled to see you. Without so much as a warning, Vakula's hands encircled Oksana's shoulders. He pressed his mouth against her kerchief, and to her horror began whispering the oddest sweet nothings she had ever heard. Oksana, as your relative, I feel it my duty to tell you a little secret, he whispered seductively. Some very important but not very nice people in Preluke are saying that your husband has become a little too rich for his own good. They say Matthew's turned into a kulak, a fist, and that he even employs Jews. Surely that can't be true. I
don't know what you're saying, cried Oksana, pulling away. How could Matthew be a fist? He's a man. You little simpleton, laughed Vakula, dropping his hands to his sides. You haven't changed at all. A KULAG, my dear, is a political term. It refers to peasants who've grown rich by exploiting hired help. You might think of picking up a copy of Pravda once in a while to keep yourself abreast of the goals of the revolution. I don't have time to read about the revolution in newspapers, said Oksana, and I don't need to read any newspapers at all to know that Matvey does not exploit others. My husband employs workers to help him grind the wheat and mill it because he can't do all of it himself. There's too much. His workers help him take the grain to market, to VOROSHILOV and Priluki. He always goes along too. He never makes his hired help do anything he doesn't do himself. He pays the men well and exploits no one, especially not David Goldman, who is our good friend as well as Matthew's right-hand man. Well then, the time has come for me to say goodbye, quipped Vakula in a business-like tone of voice. I suppose I will have to sample your nalisniki pancakes another time. At the moment, I'm actually off to buy a mare at the Okroshka. I seem to have forgotten the turn in the road. Would you mind walking me as far as the birch grove and pointing it out? Oksana froze. Luckily for her, at that very moment, an invisible hand reached down from the heavens and saved the day. The front door flew open. Out jumped Vasya, her middle son. To his mother's horror, the wiry youngster flew from the stairs into the puddle. His feet made a perfect landing next to the goose, splashing muddy water into Vakula's covetous eye. This is your Uncle Vakula, laughed Oksana, suppressing a smile. Or said Oksana, suppressing a smile. He's just returned from a long trip. Mama wants you to take him to Okroshka on your way to school. Will you do that? The little boy, who was as brown as a chestnut, jumped for joy. Oksana leaned back against the stucco wall and breathed a sigh of relief. Keeping her eyes on the birch grove, she removed her jacket and filthy boots. Meanwhile, the sun also vanished. She watched Tumbleweed and her boy vanish into the greenery, and the sun also vanished. A strong autumnal wind appeared from nowhere, swirling the leaves at Oksana's feet into a miniature cyclone. A sudden chill crossed Oksana's heart. For a second, she wanted to call Vasya back, but it was too late. Oksana had no idea what to make of the new Vakula. Clearly, Tumbleweed hadn't changed at all. He looked older, but acted exactly like he had when he was 25. Back then, he had been determined to get his own way at every turn. But what about now? What sort of things did he expect to find around the bend? And what exactly had brought Tumbleweed back to Priluki? Oksana hoped it wasn't she herself, because she was now a married woman. She also hoped that there was some white wool left in the black sheep to remind him that he was still a Cossack and subject to the most important of Cossack credos. Never raise a finger against your own kin. Okay? The second excerpt has to do with Frida Goldman trying to find her son. He's in prison. She luckily gets a job as a washerwoman in the Pisetskaya camp, where she believes he is hidden. So lilies of the valley multiplied and spread in a blanket neath the green pines. Their sweet scent could not mask the smell of death at Pisetskaya Lag. The odor of fresh corpses replenished daily overpowered the perfume of spring. The smell of death drew wolves, foxes, and bears in droves to the holes in the high barbed wire fence that surrounded the sprawling camp with its 2,000 zeks. The wild animals came and went at leisure and usually at night. Their scraggly coats still exuded musky winter smells and shed barrels of dander all over everything. Collecting her empty bucket, Frida headed back to Zotov's headquarters. The guard lowered the tip of his bayonet and let her pass. Once inside, Frida set the bucket down near Zotov's door. Sliding her hands over her apron, she knocked softly. Her face was whiter than the sheets she had washed and hung to dry between the two pines. The commandant of Plisietsk sat in a splendid leather chair in the middle of a splendid office lined in polished wood paneling. A luxurious Persian rug, the kind that Scheherazade might have dug her toes into while spinning her tales of the Arabian Nights, lay beneath his shiny leather boots. On his desk stood an expensive-looking lamp that would have felt at home at Tiffany's. Zotov's violently red hair added to his intimidating appearance, as did his uniform with its 3 gold rams, marks of great distinction. And if that weren't enough, 2 medals dangled from his chest. One was the Order of the Red Banner, and the other the Order of the Red Star. "Comrade Zotov, may I have a word with you?" said Frida timidly. Zotov did not look pleased at this question, but he nodded anyway. "Is there something wrong with your broom?" he inquired. "No, my broom is fine." "Then perhaps the kitchen stove won't light." "Oh, it lights very well, Commandant Zotov." "Then why in the devil are you bothering me? It's not easy running this camp. Get to the point." "I've decided to appeal to you in a small matter, not in your capacity as commandant, but in your capacity as the chief of personal records department at the Plisietskaya District Executive Office." "Same thing," said Zotov. "Go on." "It's about my son. I believe he's in this camp, and I thought you might be able to help me find him." Zotov removed his pince-nez and rubbed the sunken flesh. He put down his pen and the execution order he was about to sign. He folded his hands on his protruding belly and fixed his eyes on Frida. They were the color of a gutter spout. "I see. So you took this job under false pretenses, Fyodor Tarasenko, thinking to ingratiate yourself in my favor. You realize, of course, that I can have you arrested?" Yes, I realize that," said Frida. "But my son Danilo, means everything to me. Without him, I might as well be dead myself. If you arrest me now, it would only be another nail in my coffin. Please let me finish. I beg you. Then you can do what you will with me." "Proceed," yawned Zotov. "I'm a busy man." Frida moved closer to the desk behind which Zotov sat, sultan-like. Danilo was arrested by mistake almost 2 years ago, Comrade Zotov. We were living in VOROSHILOV, Ukraine at the time. He was picked up by mistake at the homestead where he worked for a kulak family. The family had already been defisted and deported when Daniel arrived the next day and was arrested by mistake. "What was he doing in a kulak homestead after the owners were taken?" inquired Zotov, rapping the table lightly. "Trying to make himself useful to the Committee of Poor Peasants. He wanted to show them where the grain was hidden, but they thought he was one of the Samsonenkos. Not being bright or articulate, he couldn't explain to the leader's satisfaction who he really was. The head of the Poor Peasants Committee wrote his name down wrong and arrested him." "And which name did your idiot son give?" "Well, the name of the people who had been deported, Samsonenko. Then he got confused and gave another name that wasn't his own. That was Goldman. I don't know which of these names actually got written down on the deportation certificate, but neither were his real name. Our family name is Tarasenko." "Your son is an idiot," repeated Zotov calmly. "Why you want him found is beyond me." "He's only a little feeble-minded," pleaded Frida. "But in all other respects he's normal, and there is not a single kulak in our family. Please make a note of that." I'm not interested in your genealogy, said Zotov sharply. Is that all? Zotov glanced at his watch, the big hand of which was slowly inching towards 12. He removed his pince-nez. His thumb and forefinger squeezed the bridge of his nose for the second time. His stomach growled loudly and distinctly. Enough of this nonsense, Comrade Tarasenko. Not a word you said smacks of truth. But tell me something. What does your son look like? Well, when Danilo was taken, he left his passport at home. I brought it with me. Here it is. You can see for yourself what he looked like at the time of capture. Zotov scrutinized the photo. Your son's name is Ukrainian, but the man in the passport, judging by his nose, is clearly a Jew. Why is that? Where we come from, everyone looks Jewish. There was a lot of intermarriage, said Frida. But the important thing is that my son, who isn't Jewish, is also no kulak. They arrested the wrong man, Commandant Zotov. You must make that wrong right. There is no such thing as the wrong man, Comrade Tarasenko, observed Zotov pedantically. Your Daniel, or whatever his name is, may not have been a kulak, but he was probably already guilty of some other crime, or would have been guilty of a crime in the future. In any case, he fully deserved incarceration. Frida did not say anything, and he continued. Here in Plisetskaya Lag, the nature of one's crime is irrelevant. No one leaves Plisetskaya alive. If for some reason a man can't work with his arms, we will make him work with his teeth. Guilty or not, your son's flesh will fertilize the taiga, and his bones will rot right here in Karelia forever, for all eternity. Now go. The floor in my wing requires a good scrubbing. I don't know where the mud comes from. And don't let me see you in this office again, unless you're accompanied by a broom. Frida Goldman reached deep into her deck of cards and pulled out her only remaining ace. It was an envelope containing the letter from Moscow, complete with the official seal, giving her permission to pay the bail for her son under the new law she had mentioned to Oksana. With the help of ALYONA'S magic typewriter, the name in the letter now read Danilo Tarasenko instead of David Goldman. Zotov ran his eyes over the letter and cast it aside. He placed the 200 rubles in his pocket and rose from his desk. Frida looked at him expectantly. Thank you. Thank you for your generous contribution to the Sick Prisoners Fund. You may go now. And by the way, Comrade Tarasenko, no need to return tomorrow. Your work in Plisetskaya is done. Thank you and goodbye. And with those words, Fiona Tarasenko's stint as Commandant Zotov's maid, arranged by Inspector Pinkovsky, came to an abrupt end. But at least her life continued. Okay. Not bored? Can I read a third one? Okay. All right, good. Let me talk to you here. So, in the third scene, we have Oksana, who's a cook on the train. Vakula Perikotipul is kind of a jack of all trades. He's now working for Inturis, and he's drafted Oksana, or blackmailed Oksana to pretend that she's also working for Inturis, and she ends up cooking. Because of the goodness of her heart, something happens to the cook, so she's now cooking for everybody in the train. And Karim Hassan, who's the ambassador, naturally notices her because she's a very fetching girl. And he wants to thank her for the meal, but he also wants to flirt with her a little bit. And so we have a three-way conversation between Vakula, Oksana, and Vakula, of course, is still interested in Oksana, and he's very jealous of Karim. So, come, Bayan Oksana said Hassan. Before you run off, let's you and I at least shake hands. I hope that we shall remain friends in the course of our journey on the Red Arrow, and perhaps even beyond. The wily Turk extended his elegantly groomed digit across the table and seized Oksana's small hand. I've been admiring the lovely gold cross on your bosom all evening, Bayan Oksana, said Hassan, sailing into another conversational channel. Thank you, said Oksana. The cross belonged to my husband. It's the only thing I have left of him now that he's dead, she admitted sadly. Lovely, just lovely, exclaimed Karim. May I? He continued to stare rapturously at Oksana as she unclasped the cross. Suddenly, Karim's fingers plucked the red carnation from his lapel and brazenly slid it across the table with reptilian speed. I'm sure your husband's cross is a great comfort to you, Oksana, continued Hassan, ignoring the look of hatred Vakula flashed him. I'm surprised that you wear it so openly in a country where God is so unwelcome, he added, narrowing his eyes. She only wears the cross at work as part of her job and interest, Vakula shot back. Though I myself am a Muslim, I'm very fond of all things related to the Orthodox faith, including Christians themselves. My grandmother, you see, was a Christian. She was deported from Turkey because of her ethnicity and resettled in Greece. I've never quite gotten over it. She was a wonderful woman. I know what you mean, said Oksana. As I told you, my entire family was deported. I still haven't gotten over my husband's death, she said, casting a sideways look at Vakula. I think it's time you brought everyone another bowl of gruel, Comrade Tarasenko, said Vakula coldly. In a minute, Vakula, said Oksana. I was just going to say, Your Excellency, that back where my sister and I come from, on the banks of the Sula, stands the ruins of a Turkish mosque, left over from the 16th century. I would go there as a child and wonder what life had been like back then. Apparently there had been so much fighting going on. So true. But the Turks didn't always fight the Cossacks, Bayan Oksana, said Karim. Surely you must know from history that sometimes we Turks even married Ukrainian women. Here Vakula turned blue. For a second Oksana thought he had choked on a piece of bread, but he quickly recovered and jumped to his feet. I beg to differ, Your Excellency. Most Ukrainian women along the Dnipro were not taken in marriage. They were enslaved. Perhaps, but not at all, rebutted Karim. Do sit down, Vakula. You are casting a shadow on Oksana's face. Hurrem Sultan was the legal wife of Suleiman the Magnificent. Now there was an example of a woman who fit her husband's hand like a glove. You may know her in your culture, not as Hurrem, but perhaps by another name. Roxolana, growled Vakula. Everyone in Ukraine knows that name. Very good, said Karim, clapping his hands. Don't you think that has a nice ring to it? It rhymes with Oksana. Oksana, Roxolana, Roxolana, Oksana. The two names are almost interchangeable, said the Turk in a little sing-song voice, smoothing down the hairs of his mustache. And just as a footnote to what I'm saying, Bayan Oksana, Roxolana became the most important woman in Suleiman's harem. Yes, indeed, the Great One ultimately married her. She made all the important political decisions for him and bore him many children. By all accounts, Suleiman loved her passionately, as only we Turks are capable of loving. Wouldn't you like to be in Roxolana's golden slippers, Oksana? Ignoring Vakula's face, which had gone from blue to red and resembled a volcano about to erupt, Oksana replied without the slightest hesitation. Forgive me, Your Excellency. I would not wish to be anyone but myself. If Roxolana were a real Ukrainian girl, she would not have been able to live without her orchard and garden, or her sheep and her geese. Ah, but what if Suleiman had 10 orchards planted for her at the palace to replace the ones she left behind in Ukraine, said Karim cajolingly. Would they contain sheep and geese? Inquired Oksana. Certainly, but of course, replied Karim, smiling broadly. A garden without sheep and geese is absurd. The animals would all be kept in a special royal enclosure, next to the harem. Roxolana brushed their wool and feathers every day herself, with a pearl-encrusted hairbrush. And that's how I would brush your hair, my dear. That's it.